Hello everyone, and welcome to the remastered 13th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring Patrick Bateman from American Psycho. I've been doing my remasters a bit out of order, but I've seen a lot of people requesting that I redo this one specifically because I didn't talk about the book when I originally made the video, so I decided to give this one a bit of precedence over some of the other ones slated for a remaster. Just like with all my previous remasters, this video is meant to bring an update in quality to the original video while rectifying any of the mistakes I made and providing you with insight into any information I left out last time around, which my coverage of the book here should accomplish quite handily. American Psycho and Patrick Bateman have become one of the most iconic stories and characters ever created. And this is yet another character that seeks to terrify viewers and readers with reality. The reality that a monster like Patrick Bateman could be sitting next to you right at this moment. The very definition of a wolf in sheep's clothing. Though we're treated to quite a lot of heinous acts throughout the film and the novel that seem to paint Patrick as a murderous deviant, his character is actually quite ambiguous, as there are many instances throughout the film and the novel that leave us with more questions than answers. And in an attempt to understand who exactly Patrick Bateman is, we're going to examine those questions and his character as a whole, so we can attempt to provide some clarity to some of the unknowns regarding Patrick, if that's even possible. But aside from being devilishly hip and brutally fashionable, one thing that has always stood out about Patrick is his complex daily care routine. And while his skincare regimen is quite daunting and complex, for you, my dear viewer, you can find your way to having the glowing skin you've always dreamed of, far more effectively and hassle-free, with our sponsor for this video, Geology. Geology is a 35-time award-winning personalized skincare company that has been recognized in Men's Health, Esquire, and Ask Men Grooming Awards. With high praise from industry professionals and over 10,000 5-star reviews from their customers, Geology has proved itself to be one of the premier skincare companies on the market. Geology is so effective because it provides you with products specifically catered to give your skin what it needs by pinpointing those needs through their 60-second diagnostic quiz. When I'd completed the quiz, Geology recommended and graciously sent me several products that have already made my skin feel better than it has in years, which is saying something for someone who's had chronic issues with acne for going on 15 years now. Everything they've sent me is scented with bergamot and juniper, two of my favorites. And while all the products they've sent me are great, I've been particularly impressed with their eye cream, as it's helped my sleep-deprived self in fighting the dark circles under my eyes, and their moisturizing morning cream, which includes SPF 15 to keep my skin protected throughout the day whenever I need to go out. You too can start enjoying healthier skin with a simple and effective personalized routine by clicking the link down in the description or by scanning the QR code on your screen. And once you get there, be sure to enter the promo code VILEI70 at checkout to receive a staggering 70% off your first month's supply. Thank you, Geology, for sponsoring this video. Now without further ado, let's begin. One thing I feel that I don't talk about often enough in these videos are the creation of these stories and the characters we find them in. And for American Psycho and Patrick Bateman, I believe delving into this story's creation provides us greater insight into its themes and his character. Bret Easton Ellis began writing American Psycho in 1986, finished in 1989, and published it in 1991. At the time he began writing, America had entered into an era of unprecedented consumerism and greed, the likes of which had never before been seen. This was the era of Gordon Gekko and the Wolf of Wall Street, when greed began to be seen as good and people as commodities to be taken advantage of. And the quintessential representative of these ideals was the yuppie. Yuppie, which is short for either young urban professional or young upwardly mobile professional, is used to describe a young professional working in a city, and while the term wasn't always viewed negatively, today yuppie has become synonymous with the vapid, greedy, and self-centered people that made exploiting people their business as they sunk ever further into decadent debauchery. While this story is ultimately a critique of many things, Bret wasn't some philosopher decrying the cruel nature of the modern world he lived in, who was writing his novel from an outside perspective. No. Bret, though to a much tamer degree, once considered himself to be a man much like Patrick Bateman. Here's what he had to say during an interview with Jeff Baker of The Oregonian when talking about the main character of his first novel. I have to say the same thing about Patrick Bateman. He was crazy the same way. He did not come out of me sitting down and wanting to write a grand sweeping indictment of yuppie culture. It initiated because of my own isolation and alienation at a point in my life. I was living like Patrick Bateman. I was slipping into a consumerist kind of void that was supposed to give me confidence and make me feel good about myself, but just made me feel worse and worse and worse about myself. That is where the tension of American Psycho came from. It wasn't that I was going to make up this serial killer on Wall Street. High concept. Fantastic. It came from a much more personal place, and that's something that I've only been admitting in the last year or so. I was so on the defensive because of the reaction to that book that I wasn't able to talk about it on that level. Bret has said that his father was an inspiration as well, as he apparently at one point had many of the traits that Patrick has, which makes it even more personal. Now what this brings to mind is something that I've talked about a few times in previous videos, including my original Patrick Bateman video. The idea that thinking evil thoughts doesn't necessarily make a person evil, actions do. At some point in all of our lives, even the saintliest among us, we've all had a violent or negative thought that we would recognize as being evil in hindsight. And the vast majority of us don't act on those thoughts because typically, they're born out of some kind of in the spur-of-the-moment frustration. If you're like most people, if you thought back to a time when you had one of these thoughts just now, chances are what popped into your head was relatively tame. However, there are many of us whose thoughts are sicker than people would assume, but unless they're non-stop fantasies that will eventually translate into action, they're still just thoughts, and they're only slightly less normal than the ones that most people have. Interestingly enough, there are plenty of authors and artists out there who are haunted by the darkest thoughts you can imagine, and believe it or not, that's a good thing, as far as storytelling goes at least, as genres like the horror genre wouldn't exist without people thinking up these brutal stories. Now, you don't need to strictly be a person who thinks about horrible things out of the blue to create a horror story, as you can be inspired to do so by hearing an account of, or experiencing some real-world horrors that caused you to come up with your idea. Which brings me to my next point. When writing a story, there are two different ways to write once you have an idea. Either you write from experience, or you write based off of research you conducted specifically for the story you're trying to tell. In practice, most stories are written using a mixture of both, and depending on the type of story you're trying to tell, you're inevitably going to lean into one more so than the other. But when you're writing a story that takes place in the modern day, writing from experience typically has an edge as far as authenticity and feel is concerned. For example, I'm sure I could write a story set in modern Nigeria, and with a heavy amount of research done about Nigerian history, culture, and society, and perhaps some help from some Nigerians that I'd interviewed, I could probably write a decent book. But it wouldn't have that extra bit of detail that would naturally flow from someone who experienced living in Nigeria, the little sights and smells that I've never experienced, the subtleties of the language and cultural norms, and so on. This is part of what makes the story of American Psycho so impactful. The fact that you're reading or watching something that wasn't just a good idea someone had, but what they actually experienced. With embellishments, of course. You're seeing Patrick behave in ways that Brett once behaved. The people Patrick converses with are echoes of people that Brett has met. And the horrid things that Patrick does are derived from thoughts that Brett has thought. While the evil we find within this story is rather exaggerated, the most horrifying thing about it all is that it's not far off from reality, and so neither is Patrick Bateman. In my first video on American Psycho, I said I wouldn't be delving into the themes and messaging of this story too much, but to understand fully who Patrick Bateman is, I believe it's important that we do so this time around. So now, we're going to start breaking down Patrick's character according to the many themes he and his story represent, and we'll start with one that you'll find to be familiar if you've been watching my videos for some time: the impact a young person's environment and the people around them have on their development. One of the greatest avenues you can take when trying to decipher how a person became evil is to look through their backstory to determine what influenced them to become villains and monsters. But as far as a backstory for Patrick is concerned, there isn't much to go off of in American Psycho. This isn't really too much of an issue, as it's more so the aspects of the world he occupies as an adult that have made Patrick into the horror show that he is. But still, it's nearly impossible for someone to develop into the type of person Patrick is without having experienced some sort of turmoil in their youth. So is there anything that indicates in this story that Patrick may have had some help from those around him in becoming who he is? Yes, there is. Like I said a moment ago, we aren't given too much in American Psycho about Patrick's background, but we are given enough to make a few inferences about what his life was like before we met him. And fortunately for us, Patrick and his family actually appear in a few other stories that offer us some more insight into his character, as Patrick and American Psycho are a part of Bret Easton Ellis's literary universe, which is comprised of the books and films Less Than Zero, The Rules of Attraction, The Informers, Glamorama, Lunar Park, Imperial Bedrooms, and The Shards. Aside from American Psycho, Patrick is only featured in 3 of these books, those being The Rules of Attraction, Glamorama, and Lunar Park, with Lunar Park being a mixture of fiction and reality that we can't really factor into his character. However, The Rules of Attraction features Patrick's brother Sean as one of the main characters, and we receive the most insight into Patrick's family in this story. In the American Psycho film, we learn that Patrick went to Harvard, and the only mention we receive of his family is that his father owns the company he works for. The book gives us slightly more detail. Patrick went to a fictional school called Exeter before he went to Harvard. Rather than just the one time his father is mentioned, Patrick's father is mentioned several times, mostly in passing like in the film. His mother is sick with some unknown illness and resides at a care facility called Sandstone. It's possible that her illness is mental in nature, as in Rules of Attraction, Sean remarks that their mother was sent away to Sandstone by their father 2 months prior to a dinner they were having. And when Patrick says things are worse at Sandstone to Sean when he calls him in the American Psycho novel, Sean responds by saying, "Like what? Mom ate her pillow?" Which suggests that she's not all there. Now in the film, when Evelyn mentions that his father practically owns the company, Patrick says he doesn't want to talk about it. And in the novel, every time his family is mentioned, he also doesn't want to talk about it. While this is enough to tell us that Patrick comes from a rich family and was likely ignored by his parents and raised by servants, there is a bit more for us to go off of. In the novel, the only time Patrick's father is mentioned outside of referring to him as partial owner of P&P is when Patrick goes to visit his mother at Sandstone. Patrick notes a photo of his father when he was a younger man on his mother's bedside table, and outside of commenting on what he's wearing, the only thing Patrick has to say about him is that there's something wrong with his eyes in this picture. This could have just been an instance of Patrick's psychosis shining through, something we'll be talking about a lot later on. But perhaps this suggests that just like Patrick, there's something wrong with his father on a deeper level that had an effect on the man Patrick matured into. In the Rules of Attraction, we learn from Sean's inner thoughts that their father was quite the ladies' man, which suggests that he frequently cheated on his wife, a habit he seems to have passed on to his sons. Other than this bit of information though, the only thing we learn about Patrick's father here is that he at some point fell ill with a disease that was considered terminal, though we never learn whether or not he survived it. While Patrick was present at the hospital his father was housed at, we never see Patrick interacting directly with his father, but we do have a short 3-page chapter where Patrick goes to visit his mother. When he's there, she's heavily sedated, and their conversation doesn't veer past her asking what he wants for Christmas, her observation that he looks unhappy, and some small talk about how a party Patrick attended went. Patrick does note though that his mother is wearing a nightgown and slippers that he bought for her last Christmas, which might indicate that she favors Patrick in some small way, and the fact that Patrick is even visiting his mother indicates to us that he perhaps has a more loving relationship with her than he does with the other members of his family. But considering their conversation is as superficial as most of his other conversations are with people, whatever tenderness lay between the two must be on the decline. What also supports this notion is something Patrick says to Sean in Rules of Attraction, as he comments to Sean that it's about time, and when he learns that their mother has been sent to Sandstone during a dinner they were having. And if it weren't for the fact that Patrick actually made the effort to visit his mother, I'd say that's enough evidence to suggest that he doesn't care much for her. Even with his visitation though, it's possible that he doesn't care for her anyway, and he was just doing what he needed to do in order to one day secure whatever inheritance she had planned for him, as one of the tactics that Patrick was supposed to use to convince his brother to come to dinner with him in the American Psycho novel was to tell him that there was an issue with their mother's estate, which is something that Patrick might have also been worried about, causing him to visit his mother to stay in her good graces. As far as his brother goes, there are some things that occur between the two in both novels in regard to their relationship that we can use to further understand Patrick. The Bateman family seems to have lived in several different places over the years. As in either American Psycho or Rules of Attraction, there's mention of their father's suite in New York, their grandfather's home in Connecticut, a family home in Newport, Rhode Island, and a house in Larchmont, New York. The only real evidence we have of what their childhood was like is a photo their mother has in their room at Sandstone of the two unsmiling brothers when they were younger, and then this passage in Rules of Attraction, where Sean is trying to recall any memories he has of his time spent growing up in Larchmont. I went by the house in Larchmont late last night. It was for sale. Harold still lives in back. My MG was still mercifully kept in one of the garages, but my room upstairs was empty, and most of the furniture from the house had been removed and taken someplace I forgot to ask about. The house itself was locked up, and I had to break in through one of the French windows in back. The house still seems enormous, even larger to me now than when I was growing up in it, but there hadn't been much time spent in the house. School was at Andover. Holidays were usually spent elsewhere. The house brought back few, almost no memories to me. The ones I had, weirdly enough, included Patrick, playing in the snow with him on the front lawn, which seemed to stretch out for miles, getting high and playing ping pong with him in the rec room. There was the pool no one was allowed to swim in, and the rules about no noise. That was all I could dredge up, since that place was a transient's home for me. So like most sibling relationships, Sean and Patrick's had its ups and downs, but at some point in time, the downs defined their relationship more than the ups did, and that might have to do with the pretty stark differences between the two brothers. Sean is a wannabe bohemian turned drug dealer who's as irresponsible as Patrick is brutal. Sean has deviated from his family's plans for him, and though he's not nearly as unhinged as Patrick, he has several issues that make him a less than desirable person. In the Rules of Attraction, it's heavily implied that Patrick looks down on his brother as a loser druggy burnout who he's going to be saddled with once his father dies, and though he tries to convince Sean to care more about the situation with his father and his direction in life, Sean could care less, and Patrick resents him all the more for it. Despite this, there's evidence to suggest that Patrick in part hates his brother because he's envious of him. At different points in American Psycho, Patrick is referred to as a dork, and while he's as good-looking and well-dressed as anyone else, there's just something about Patrick that isn't quite good enough to be considered the hippest man on the scene, which could be attributed to the fact that Patrick tries way too hard to fit in, and when you're trying to be something that you aren't, or place an inordinate amount of care on something, people notice. This is something that bothers Patrick on a deep level, and part of the reason why that could be, outside of the fact that he wants to be considered cool and fit in, is because their younger brother seems to have more influence in their world, and is more likable than Patrick is. Sean only appears in one chapter in the American Psycho book, when he and Patrick are getting together to celebrate his birthday, which is also meant to double as a discussion about what Sean has been up to, as requested by his father's accountant and the trustee of his estate, as it would appear that Sean marches to the beat of his own drum and isn't in contact with his family much. In the run-up to this, Patrick explains how he despises his brother, and that his brother despises him as well. And just like Patrick, Sean doesn't seem to care for his parents either. The biggest difference between Sean and Patrick, though, is that Sean seems to have a laissez-faire attitude towards life in general. One of the struggles Patrick has throughout American Psycho is that unlike some of his other friends and associates, Patrick is unable to get into the fabled Dorsia, the restaurant to end all restaurants that only the most privileged and hip get into. Not only is Sean able to get them into Dorsia by speaking to the owner, but Sean could care less about the place, to the point that he doesn't even eat the food that he orders, which happens to be the most expensive dishes on the menu. And while they're there, we learn that Sean, unlike Patrick, doesn't really care about any of the superficial aspects of Patrick's world. Patrick cares about the clothes people wear. Sean does not. Patrick fawns over women. Sean could care less about them, even the ones that come onto him. Patrick tries his best to be as cool as he can be. Sean is simply just existing in the space and letting his natural personality carry him through life. In short, Patrick has to try and be the man that he thinks he wants to be, while all of those things come naturally to Sean. And because he's his younger brother, I'm sure the fact that Sean is more likable and well-respected than he is has significantly impacted Patrick's self-esteem. The last bit of information I have to share with you about Patrick's childhood comes from a website containing emails from Patrick that he writes long after this story is concluded. And though it's debatable whether or not these emails are canon, what little Patrick says about his childhood here is very much in line with what we've discussed so far. It's very hard to say no to your child. I was told either yes, or my request was met with a stony silence that I understood to mean no. There was not much communication growing up in the Bateman household, as it never existed in the first place. I never missed it. It just wasn't there. Now, while what we've gone through about Patrick's family and childhood wasn't too substantial, knowing that Patrick has a superficial and close to non-existent relationship with his parents, a bad relationship with a brother he's envious of, and that his childhood was probably decadent, but emotionally disconnected, is enough to clue us in on how Patrick began his tenure in the wild world of 1980s Wall Street, and why he's so desperate to fit in and establish himself as one of the who's who of the who's who. But as much as this confirms a lot of things about Patrick's character that would have otherwise been left to speculation, and while it is important in understanding what drove Patrick to be the crazed yuppie he is, as I said earlier, it's really what he's been exposed to as an adult that made Patrick into who he is. Which brings us to the next theme that I'd like to discuss with you: the destructive and corrupting aspects of consumerism, materialism, and capitalism in its most extreme form. Capitalistic systems have to date been responsible for making the modern world into the marvel of technological progress and increased quality of life that has improved the lives of billions of people. Though that might be true, there's nothing in this world that doesn't have some sort of downside, or many downsides to it. And American Psycho and Patrick Bateman are representative of almost every downside to capitalism, and they all stem from one glaring issue with it: that in its purest and unchecked form, the only thing that matters is profits. Without regulations and laws, there are natural exploitative practices that manifest in capitalist systems due to profits being a business person or business owner's primary concern when conducting business, while everything else is secondary. As much as it would be nice to live in a perfect world where everyone conducted their business in the most moral ways possible, that simply does not happen. This is why, in the United States at least, we have things like child labor laws, antitrust laws, and environmental protection laws, because if you don't say someone can't do something, chances are they're going to do it, especially if they're going to make money off it. While various laws and regulations have made great strides in curbing the injustices that come as a byproduct of capitalism, there are plenty of things that are done in the name of profits that seem harmless, but severely impact the well-being of not just those being exploited, but the exploiters. And that's no more apparent than in the overglorification of materialism and consumerism. Cars, clothes, jewelry, food, beauty products, electronics, property, and everything else that's sold is marketed to you with the hopes that you don't just buy things, but that you buy as much as you can, and then work so you can buy even more expensive things. But notice that I said it's the overglorification of these things that's the problem here, and not necessarily the marketing, the consumerism, and the materialism themselves, as there's plenty of good that comes from these things. Hell, I know pretty much everybody hates this, but every YouTuber, including myself, owes their existence on this platform to marketing, consumerism, and materialism. And if these aspects of our society didn't exist, you probably wouldn't be watching this video right now. No, it's the fact that consumerism and materialism have in many respects become as important to us as eating and drinking. So many different things that you can buy dictate what people think about you. And even if you're not a person that's looking to impress others, and you're content to exist in your own space, chances are that you're still dedicating a significant amount of your energy to buying the things that you do want. And as we're pressured by everything and everyone around us to purchase more and more things, we end up placing so much importance on things that we want, or what we think others want from us, while placing less and less importance on what we actually need. Not to mention that it can alter your personality and psyche in many different negative ways. And American Psycho shows us just how bad it can get. In the film, there are several moments where ludicrous levels of importance are placed on what people are wearing, where they live, where they hang out, where they're eating, what accounts they're working on, and famously, the subtle lettering and off-white coloring of business cards. While this does show us how vapid and superficial all the people in this story are, it's taken to the next level in the novel. Here's an example for you. Price seems nervous and edgy, and I have no desire to ask him what's wrong. He's wearing a linen suit by Canale Milano, a cotton shirt by Ike Behar, a silk tie by Bill Blass, and cap-toed leather lace-ups from Brooks Brothers. I'm wearing a lightweight linen suit with pleated trousers, a cotton shirt, a dotted silk tie, all by Valentino Couture, and perforated cap-toe leather shoes by Alan Edmonds. Once inside Harry's, we spot David Van Patten and Craig McDermott at a table up front. Van Patten is wearing a double-breasted woolen silk sport coat, button-fly woolen silk trousers with inverted pleats by Mario Valentino, a cotton shirt by Gitman Brothers, a polka dot silk tie by Bill Blass, and leather shoes from Brooks Brothers. McDermott is wearing a woven linen suit with pleated trousers, a button-down cotton and linen shirt by Basile, a silk tie by Joseph Aboud, and ostrich loafers from Susan Bennis Warren Edwards. This kind of inner monologue from Patrick occurs whenever he meets with someone, but that's nothing compared to the description Patrick gives us of his apartment and his daily routine. In the early light of a May dawn, this is what the living room of my apartment looks like. Over the white marble and granite gas log fireplace hangs an original David Onika. It's a 6-foot by 4-foot portrait of a naked woman, mostly done in muted graves and olives, sitting on a chaise lounge watching MTV. The backdrop a Martian landscape, a gleaming mauve desert scattered with dead, gutted fish, smashed plates rising like a sunburst above the woman's yellow head, and the whole thing is framed in black aluminum steel. The painting overlooks a long white down-filled sofa and a 30-inch digital TV set from Toshiba. It's a high-contrast, highly defined model, plus it has a 4-corner video stand with a high-tech tube combination from NEC, with a picture-in-picture digital effects system, plus freeze frame. The audio includes built-in MTS and a 5-watt per channel onboard amp. A Toshiba VCR sits in a glass case beneath the TV set. It's a super high-band beta unit and has built-in editing function including a character generator, with 8-page memory, a high-band record and playback, and 3-week, 8-event timer. I'm not going to read any further, because I'm sure you get the picture, but this dialogue goes on for 6 pages, and while we only hear these descriptions from Patrick because he's our narrator, all the various characters in this story show us at different points that they're just as concerned with all these material items as Patrick is. Now maybe being this transfixed on material items wouldn't be so bad if this was your hobby, but for these people, it's not a hobby, it's their entire lives, and this hyperfixation on products has transformed them into vapid and shallow people whose lives are as empty and meaningless as the various things they believe hold so much meaning. And because these people are so focused on commodities, they have begun to view and treat other people as commodities as well, and suffering, worldly affairs, and complex social issues are relegated to mechanisms with which these people can impress one another with the repetition of headlines they've seen on TV or read in magazines. And if they aren't that, then they're simply just punchlines. With people placed in the same category as cars and clothes, the characters in this story are often seen mistaking each other for someone else, not just because they all look the same, but because it doesn't really matter whether or not you're talking to the right person, as all that matters is that you look and act the part. While people in this story claim to be friends and acquaintances, they only are because they need to be, because hanging around influential people is part of what makes you influential, and in reality, not a single person in this story is truly friends with another. They only claim to be, and this is exemplified by the fact that they all talk about one another behind each other's backs whenever they get the chance, because making other people seem less than you is an easy way for the other people around you to think more of you. Another common occurrence is that everybody seems to be cheating on one another with either their friends or random people they meet in clubs, bars, and restaurants, people they immediately forget after using them for their bodies. This is more pronounced in the book, where Patrick and his friends are always on the lookout for hard bodies, as they call them, and both women and men are only ever judged by their looks and the way they speak and act, with nothing of substance ever being a concern for the happy denizens of the cult of the dollar. While how they treat each other is dehumanizing, the way they view those less fortunate than them is even worse. Ugly women only have personalities because they're ugly. People riding the bus and the subway are filthy animals who don't have the drive to become rich off of daddy's money. Homeless people are even worse trash, who are to be punished and ridiculed whenever the chance arises, which in the novel is something Patrick and his friends do often by pretending to give a homeless man or woman money before snatching it away from them. If you're not rich, you're a loser. If you're not wearing the finest clothes, you're a loser. If you're concerned with anything aside from the most surface level of things, you're a loser. These attitudes are made all the more abhorrent by the fact that most of the people in this story seem to do nothing at all. Most if not all of the people we encounter are Wall Street bankers, and while we hear of them handling various accounts and see them having meetings, we're never given any detail about those accounts, and the meetings are only an extension of whatever conversations they were having at the water cooler or at dinner the previous night. Patrick specifically is shown doing nothing when he's at work. There is never a point in the film, nor the novel, where we find Patrick actually working. He goes to his office, yes, but he never does any work. While I'm sure these people do something, like handling the money of people richer than they are, I believe the point of showing them having an absence of any real work, and not really contributing anything of substance to society, is to emphasize how utterly absurd who they are is. These people create nothing. They're essentially useless to society, yet they are rewarded with the highest honors and monstrous wealth that they then squander on vain and materialistic nonsense so they can join the giant circle jerk that is high society, all the while exploiting the people who do contribute and who don't take advantage of others as they please, looking down on them as less, when in reality even a cashier at McDonald's is more useful and meaningful than they are. Something that highlights the absurdity of who these people are, their viewpoints, and their behaviors in the novel is the presence of the Les Miserables musical. At the time the novel takes place, the hottest musical in New York City was the musical rendition of Victor Hugo's novel Les Miserables. And for those of you who are unaware, Les Miserables is the story of a French peasant who's imprisoned for 19 years for stealing a loaf of bread to feed his sister's starving child. After being released and taking refuge with a bishop, Jean steals the bishop's silver, but when the police capture him, the bishop pretends like he gave Jean the silver as a gift, and he implores him to become an honest man afterwards, which he does, eventually becoming wealthy and adopting an orphan girl by the name of Cosette. I'm not going to go much further with a synopsis, as Les Miserables is quite a long tale, but it becomes a highly moral and human story centered around Jean and Cosette's lives, and it is not a story that any of the characters in American Psycho can identify with in the slightest. Les Miserables is frequently brought up by characters in this story, and they only bring it up because it's one of the hottest things right now, and they're always concerned with what's hot. They probably couldn't even tell you what it's about, and no one ever does in either the novel or the film. Instead, they talk about its music or the people that were attending the show. This emotional rollercoaster of a story that strikes at the very core of what it means to be human is thus reduced to a set piece on a stage of corruption and decadence that is the modern world. And to emphasize just how wrong this pairing is, I'd like for you to hear what Victor Hugo had to say about Les Miserables in his preface to it, and what he said to his Italian publisher about the novel. Here's the preface. So long as there shall exist, by reason of law and custom, a social condemnation which, in the face of civilization, artificially creates hell on earth, and complicates a destiny that is divine with human fatality, so long as the three problems of the age, the degradation of man by poverty, the ruin of women by starvation, and the dwarfing of childhood by physical and spiritual night, are not solved, so long as, in certain regions, social asphyxia shall be possible. In other words, and from a yet more extended point of view, so long as ignorance and misery remain on earth, books like this cannot be useless. And here is what he said to his publisher. I don't know whether it will be read by everyone, but it is meant for everyone. It addresses England as well as Spain, Italy as well as France, Germany as well as Ireland, the republics that harbor slaves, as well as empires that have serfs. Social problems go beyond frontiers. Those huge sores that litter the world do not stop at the blue and red lines drawn on maps. Wherever men go in ignorance or despair, wherever women sell themselves for bread, wherever children lack a book to learn from, or a warm hearth, Les Miserables knocks at the door and says, "Open up, I am here for you." While this book was meant for everyone, not everyone understands what it's trying to tell them, and such is the case with these yuppies who might have a change of heart if they seriously considered this story's message. But that's the thing, they don't have the capacity to do so because they have been so corrupted by the world around them that it has become impossible. And while consumerism and materialism have been chiefly responsible for that, the next theme I'd like to touch on, conformity, is what elevates consumerism and materialism from a malign influence into a veritable cult. It's not just that the people in this story place so much importance on objects and things that's the problem. It's the fact that they promote the idea that unless you put so much care into these objects and things, you can't be a part of the elite. You're not hip if you don't wear the right clothes. You're not cool if you can't talk about the latest fashion trends in GQ and the in-restaurants in Zagat. If you're not doing the drugs everyone's doing, you're a dork. If you don't sleep around and treat women like meat, you're a pussy. Conform or get out. This is the trap that yuppie culture, and others like it, has laid. One that causes people to betray themselves so they can become cogs in a materialistic machine rather than the people they would have been otherwise. There is not a single instance in either the film or the novel that we ever see any of these characters' true selves. These people and their personalities are all fabrications, and in that way, what American Psycho presents us with is truly a cult, as what a cult seeks to do is destroy your true self so they can reinvent you in accordance with their own belief systems, taking all your individuality away in service to a grander idea. And while there is no grand idea at play here, all that was instilled within the people in this story was a desire to become everything they believed they dreamed of being, and in doing so, they lose themselves and become one with the great circus that is yuppie culture. This even applies to one's sexuality, as the world of American Psycho is hypermasculine, and so femininity and homosexuality are very much unwelcome. F-bombs are rampant in the novel, and it's implied that several characters, not just Patrick, which we'll talk about later, might actually have different sexual inclinations that are repressed by the world they live in. While this is true, and conforming to something typically means that you're sacrificing parts of yourself in order to fit in, the type of conformity championed by the people in this story actually does the opposite. To fit into the world Patrick is trying to be a part of, you have to be as self-absorbed as you possibly can be. They want you to think, dress, act, and live like them, but they want you to do so by only caring about your own wants and needs, which will allow you to make more connections, make more money, and buy ever more things as you tread the path of the golden elite. And it's this rampant and institutionalized selfishness that opens the door for all manner of deplorable thinking and behavior, which sends people down paths that destroy them, leaving them with severe mental and emotional problems, as well as dangerous addictions. Patrick embodies every single one of these themes, but he doesn't just embody them, he is meant to represent them at their most extreme form, and boy does he. As we've already discussed, Patrick likely had an emotionally distant childhood, and at the time this story begins, Patrick is a vapid, narcissistic, and almost entirely emotionless creature. On the surface, he's a well-dressed and handsome 80s yuppie like any of his so-called friends, and he seems as normal as anyone else around him. In the novel, we get to experience what's wrong with Patrick through his narration, and though we get some of that in the film as well, the novel gives us much more. But in the film, we do get a surface-level characteristic of Patrick that further emphasizes his bizarre nature, the way he speaks and moves when talking with his friends or colleagues. It's not overly noticeable, but he does seem a bit off in these moments, and here's where you get some indication that much of what he's doing and saying in the presence of these people is fabricated, as Patrick, unlike those around him, seems like he's trying a little too hard to be the person that he thinks he needs to be. While his erratic behavior in the film is something to note, what should really be noted about Patrick is how far gone he is. Patrick is entirely consumed with himself, and to say he's a malignant narcissist is an understatement. He's hyper-obsessed with his appearance, and while we get a glimpse of this in the film, in the novel, it seems as if every other page Patrick is remarking about some aspect of his appearance, how muscular he is, how his hair or tan looks. Patrick is always worried about his appearance and what others think of him. Every interaction he has with or has thought about another person is also only ever considered as far as his own wants and needs are concerned, and all Patrick ever thinks about are materialistic things. Reservations at restaurants, the clothes people are wearing, skincare products, videotapes. There is nothing rattling around in Patrick Bateman's head, aside from every little detail he needs to succeed in the world he desperately wants to fit into. That being said, there is something else that roams around in Patrick's mind, the humanity he's left behind that has been transformed into an abomination. Because of his ardent adherence to all the themes we've discussed, Patrick is essentially no longer human. He's a walking magazine article with not a single original thought that doesn't have to do with his own misery, violence, or sex. And throughout the film, we find Patrick engaging in all manner of horrendous behavior. He kills and tortures several women, murders Paul Allen, a homeless man, a dog, and several police officers and bystanders. But in the novel, oh my, is it so much worse. Patrick kills dozens more people in the novel than he does in the film, which even includes a child. And he does so in such a gruesomely horrendous way most of the time, that even though I'd like to tell you all about them to emphasize just how horrific Patrick's actions are, I would get in a lot of trouble for doing so. And I wouldn't even blame YouTube for it considering just how grotesque the descriptions in the book are. I think it's enough to say that Patrick tortures people and animals in ways you could probably never imagine. And he also engages in cannibalism at one point, and the violence is quite frankly stomach-turning. However, though the violence in this story is gratuitous, even the over-the-top descriptions in the novel are necessary in driving home just how dire its themes are, as the violence we're shown here represents the degradation of a human soul down to a nub that results from a person's exposure to the kind of lifestyle we see Patrick Bateman living. There's something Patrick says of himself that's present in the film, but is more fleshed out in the novel, that emphasizes this notion. Everything failed to subdue me. Soon everything seemed dull. another sunrise, the lives of heroes, falling in love, war, the discoveries people made about each other. The only thing that didn't bore me, obviously enough, was how much money Tim Price made. And yet in its obviousness, it did. There wasn't a clear, identifiable emotion within me, except for greed, and possibly total disgust. I had all the characteristics of a human being: flesh, blood, skin, hair, but my depersonalization was so intense, had gone so deep, that the normal ability to feel compassion had been eradicated, the victim of a slow, purposeful erasure. I was simply imitating reality, a rough resemblance of a human being, with only a dim corner of my mind functioning. Something horrible was happening, and yet I couldn't figure out why. I couldn't put my finger on it. Slowly, over time, whoever Patrick might have been has been destroyed by everything he's experienced and everything he's tried to make himself into. Though the title of this story is American Psycho, and though I claim Patrick was a psychopath in my initial video, it would be more accurate to state that Patrick has become a narcissistic sociopath, which is something we recently discussed in my video on Pearl. From the website Choosing Therapy, here is a description of what a narcissistic sociopath is. A narcissistic sociopath is a person who displays both narcissistic and antisocial personality traits. NPD is characterized as a grandiose sense of self-importance, an attitude of entitlement or arrogance, and an excessive need for external validation. The symptoms of ASPD include impulsivity, aggression, and a total disregard for rules, laws, and social norms. A narcissistic sociopath, also called a narcopath, or malignant narcissist, has both disorders and is considered one of the most dangerous, psychologically disturbed kinds of people. Their complete lack of empathy and regard for the feelings or needs of other people make them much more likely to act out behaviors that are typically considered wrong, bad, or even evil. Unlike classic narcissists, sociopathic narcissists are not only driven by their own self-interest. Some experts believe that narcissistic sociopaths are sadistic and derive pleasure or satisfaction from the suffering of other people. This makes them less predictable and also more dangerous than classic narcissists, as they may deceive, exploit, or harm someone even when there is nothing for them to gain from doing so. Additionally, here are 10 signs that someone is a narcissistic sociopath from the same website. They live in a deluded reality. They are obsessed with power and control. They take advantage of and use other people. They have no moral boundaries. They have a limited range of emotion. They have a huge discard pile. They become hostile when threatened. They feed off of negative energy. They get bored easily, and they are empty inside. Sounds an awful lot like Patrick if you ask me. There's a famous monologue from the film that's quoted quite often, and I used it in my previous video to emphasize just how much Patrick Bateman is a manufactured entity, and how everything he presents to the outside world is nothing more than a facade, a carefully crafted mask that's been sculpted to perfection and molded into the image of a sane human being. There is an idea of a Patrick Bateman, some kind of abstraction, but there is no real me, only an entity, something illusory. And though I can hide my cold gaze, and you can shake my hand and feel flesh gripping yours, and maybe you can even sense our lifestyles are probably comparable, I simply am not there. However, this monologue was actually shortened for the film, and another part of it was used at the end of the film. Here is what the rest of the monologue is. It is hard for me to make sense on any given level. Myself is fabricated, an aberration. I am a non-contingent human being. My personality is sketchy and unformed. My heartlessness goes deep and is persistent. My conscience, my pity, my hopes disappeared a long time ago, probably at Harvard, if they ever did exist. There are no more barriers to cross. All I have in common with the uncontrollable and the insane, the vicious and the evil, all the mayhem I have caused in my utter indifference towards it, I have now surpassed. I still, though, hold on to one single bleak truth. No one is safe. Nothing is redeemed. Yet I am blameless. Each model of human behavior must be assumed to have some validity. Is evil something you are, or is it something you do? My pain is constant and sharp, and I do not hope for a better world for anyone. In fact, I want my pain to be inflicted on others. I want no one to escape. But even after admitting this, and I have countless times, in just about every act I've committed, and coming face to face with these truths, there is no catharsis. I gain no deeper knowledge about myself. No new understanding can be extracted from my telling. There has been no reason for me to tell you any of this. This confession has meant nothing. Everything we've discussed so far tells us who Patrick is, or more appropriately, who he isn't. He isn't like you and I. He's an emotional void, a husk of a human being. Though he might feel he is empty, he does contain something within him, a creature hiding under a cover of humanity, emerging when opportunity allows to sate its greed and bloodlust, or when its desires become too much to bear, and it can no longer contain them within the shell that is Patrick. In a sense, we can view Patrick as having two different sides, but not multiple personalities. There's the crafted Patrick and the primal Patrick. He's a beast who's managed to create for himself a costume to wear whilst hunting for his prey. His primal side is what carries his greed, disgust, and envy, and his husk contains all the artificial emotion he needs to be able to get by in the outside world. His disregard for human life, his obsessive desire to always be the best among his peers, and his insatiable lust for both sex and violence lie at the heart of his primary emotions. His desire to kill comes from either a place of disgust, as seen with the homeless man in the alley, bloodlust, as is the case with his murder of various women, or jealous rage, in the case of Paul Allen. Sadism is central to every crime Patrick commits as well, as in the novel particularly. He's always trying to exact as much pleasure from his kills and the sex that he has with people. Part of the reason why this could be is because Patrick, a man who is so far gone from humanity, can only feel truly human when he's engaged in the insane and the debaucherous, experiencing any shred of life that he can by abusing life in the most profane ways. His constant need for this type of stimulation could support this idea. Whenever he's alone, the only things we see playing on the TV are pornography or something horrific, like when he's listening to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre as he works out. And as I said in my initial video, I think the fact that he's playing Texas Chainsaw Massacre is meant to be a little Easter egg, considering he's obsessed with Ed Gein and serial killers, as the creation of Leatherface was influenced by Ed Gein. Also in my previous video, I claimed that the only real insane characteristic Patrick has is his apparent love for music, but I did mention that this could be another way for him to put on airs and impress his friends, and after reading the novel, I think it is possible that he does love music, but it's more likely than not that this is just another thing Patrick obsesses over, so he can both stay in the know with his friends and present them with some pop culture knowledge that will boost him up in their eyes. Why I believe this to be the case now is because there are a few chapters in the novel that are entirely dedicated to Patrick's thoughts about different artists, but those thoughts seem like they were taken straight out of some magazine, so I doubt his musical interests are genuine. It's also interesting to note that Patrick doesn't really like live music, which is something he says in the novel, and perhaps he's uncomfortable with it, because attending a live music performance means that you have to be around people living life, and Patrick doesn't really know how to live life. I also stated in the last video that he makes a few socially conscious and politically correct remarks throughout the film that leave us believing that he's just putting on another face, but that the way he makes these remarks when he's applying them to music made me think that perhaps when he tells McDermott to cool it with the anti-Semitic remarks, and when he goes on a diatribe at a spas about the problems that are plaguing the world, he's being genuine. And somewhere within Patrick, under the weight of consumerism and his wild bloodlust, is a deeply caring man. I see why I came to that conclusion, but after reading the novel, no. Absolutely not. Patrick doesn't care at all about the world around him. As in the novel, he's much more racist, homophobic, and elitist than he is in the film, and if I had read the novel back then, I would have never made such a claim, as this is clearly yet another example of him putting on airs for his friends. One thing that's never made clear as well is whether or not Patrick is closeted. As in the film, rather than killing Lewis once he expresses his feelings for him, like you'd expect him to, he doesn't, which is something that does allow us to speculate. But the novel does give us a few more instances of their interactions that really call into question whether or not Patrick is gay or bisexual. One of the times that he sees Lewis after this moment, Lewis ends up crying and begging Patrick in a department store to be with him. And while Patrick doesn't exactly console him, he does say that the reason he doesn't want to be with him is because he isn't attracted to him. And this is interesting, because every time he interacts with Lewis, he doesn't say he isn't gay or bisexual, just that he isn't attracted to him. And when you consider Patrick has murdered people for less, the fact that Lewis humiliates him with a breakdown in public and could potentially tell people that he's gay should be enough for Patrick to want to murder him. And because he doesn't, this could indicate that Patrick is repressing even more than we previously thought. And this could even mean that his violence against women could partially be attributed to his repressed sexuality. Another indicator that Patrick's sexuality might be repressed is his murder of a gay man in a park that was complimenting him. This murder is quick, public, and brutal, but before he does so, Patrick seems to have a really good conversation with him, and the fact that he does might be what drove him to murdering this man. Now these are all the different aspects of Patrick that have made him into the beast we find in this story, and at face value, it's fairly easy to write him off as a monster. But now we have to try and delve into the great unknown regarding Patrick. That great unknown being, did Patrick actually commit any crimes in this story, or is he just suffering from a case of severe delusions, or schizophrenia? This is intentionally left ambiguous at the end of this story, and while I do think it's best left this way, I'd still like to attempt to make inferences on what we're given. In both the film and the novel, there are two very distinct possible delusions that can make or break our view of Patrick. The first is people's blatant disregard for the horrible things Patrick says to them, and the second is whether he commits any of these murders at all. For both of these things, I'd say they're partially real and partially delusions. People all around Patrick are constantly mistaking one person for another, and it's their self-absorption that is the primary reason this happens. And when Patrick does talk about murders and executions, rather than mergers and acquisitions with certain characters, they're wholly unaware of what's going on outside of their own bubble, and they could care less about what anyone else has to say. However, there are multiple times in the novel where Patrick goes far beyond what anyone could mistake for something else. And I do believe that there are moments where Patrick is imagining himself saying these things to people when he actually isn't. One of the bigger pieces of evidence for this is a conversation he has with a woman named Bethany, which is one of the few conversations he has with someone that isn't entirely vapid and free from his violent inner monologue. And when he does say something violent to Bethany, she's appropriately appalled by it, which shows us that he does speak to people this way, but the more egregious examples of him doing so are still likely delusions. Now, as for whether or not Patrick has killed anyone, I think the novel does a much better job of showing us how delusional Patrick is, and thus leads us more so toward the conclusion that much of Patrick's crimes are fantasy rather than reality. But there are still some that he commits that are real. Everyone having constant blinders on could be a reason why Patrick gets away with what he does. And when he does actually commit murders, I believe this is why he gets away with them. If this weren't the case, the messaging of this story would mean less, as it's saying something that people would become so self-absorbed that they would completely disregard murderous behavior and confessions that happen right in front of their eyes. So I would say that whatever murder he committed to make his sheets bloody, the murder of Paul Allen, and perhaps his murder of the homeless man, were all real. Though someone did note in the comments that when Patrick is dragging Paul Allen's body through his apartment's lobby, that the blood trail disappears when the camera pans back to it. That being said, it's also appropriate that becoming a person like Patrick Bateman would turn you into a violently delusional person. The more unbelievable occurrences in the film are his murder of Christy and Elizabeth, one of whom he chases naked through the halls of his apartment, and the rampage he goes on after he's asked by an ATM to feed it a stray kitten. And while there are so many instances of him murdering women in brutal and obvious ways in the novel, there are 3 things in the novel that are missing in the film that tell us that some of these things are definitely a fantasy. In the novel, Patrick often refers to the fictitious Patty Winter Show, which is supposed to be a show like the Oprah Winfrey Show. The thing about the Patty Winter Show, though, is that the topics get increasingly more bizarre as the story progresses, and typically, when the more insanely violent things happen in the novel, there was mention of some weird topic being featured on the Patty Winter Show, like an interview with Bigfoot, whom Patrick found surprisingly articulate and charming, or a Cheerio sitting on a very small chair that was interviewed for close to an hour. Another thing that makes me question whether these murders are real is that Patrick narrates his rampage in the third person in the novel, which could indicate that Patrick was playing out some kind of fantasy in his head. The last thing is the fact that Patrick says at one point that he was watching his maid clean up blood and gore in his apartment, which is something that definitely wouldn't have happened. These things, backed up by the fact that all the murders Patrick commits in the novel are beyond brutal, indicates to me that what we're seeing is more so a fantasy than reality. But that doesn't mean that those fantasies don't spill over into reality sometimes, as I said a moment ago. I have all the characteristics of a human being: blood, flesh, skin, hair, but not a single, clear, identifiable emotion, except for greed and disgust. Something horrible is happening inside of me, and I don't know why. My nightly bloodlust has overflown into my days. I feel lethal, on the verge of frenzy. I think my mask of sanity is about to slip. When Patrick says this, I believe he's saying so because he thinks he will soon be unable to control his bloodlust and will embark on a deadly rampage before long. But with the delusions taken into account, I think it's more likely that his possible schizophrenia is getting so much worse that reality and delusion are beginning to merge into one, and he soon won't be in control of his own mind. So yes, while Patrick is certainly ill and suffering from severe delusions throughout this story, I do believe that at least some of the murders he commits are very real. Now here is where I talked about the possibility of Patrick being remorseful for what he's done in my previous video, but I don't think Patrick has any remorse in him this time around. The only instance in the film where Patrick seems to be showing any remorse for what he's done is when he's leaving a voicemail for his lawyer. He's clearly having a hard time talking about all of these things, and for a moment, we're almost made to believe that he could be experiencing genuine remorse. But then he says he's not sure he's going to get away with it this time. He isn't having a breakdown because he feels guilty, rather he's in such distress because he's afraid he's going to be caught. He does put in that he must be a pretty sick guy, but even that seems like a half-hearted admission. After reading the novel, it's clear that Patrick isn't remorseful for anything he's done. However, the novel does tell us something about Patrick that the film only accomplishes in a very minor way, that he's a soul in torment, and that he desperately wishes he wasn't. Again, there are 3 things that show this to us. I mentioned earlier a conversation Patrick has with a woman named Bethany. Bethany is an old girlfriend of his from his Harvard days, and aside from Sean and his mother, she is the only person that we see in this story that Patrick knows from his past. When Patrick meets with Bethany, he's an absolute wreck. He knows that this woman knows part of the real him, the Patrick he was before he was so thoroughly corrupted. and while he's worried that she'll see the monster he's become and spread the word, he's also suffering immense distress here because she's a reminder of the humanity that he no longer possesses. This scene is replaced by his dinner with Jean in the film, but rather than restraining himself like he does there, here he actually murders Bethany in brutal fashion, taking his rage and anger out on her as he ridicules her during the murder and after her death. However, Patrick still has dinner with Jean in the novel, and this is another instance of us being shown Patrick's desire to regain some of his lost humanity. During their dinner, we get the following line: "A flood of reality. I get an odd feeling that this is a crucial moment in my life, and I'm startled by the suddenness of what I guess passes for an epiphany. There is nothing of value I can offer her. For the first time, I see Jean as uninhibited. She seems stronger, less controllable, wanting to take me into a new and unfamiliar land, the dreaded uncertainty of a totally different world. I sense she wants to rearrange my life in a significant way. Her eyes tell me this, and though I see truth in them, I also know that one day, sometime very soon, she too will be locked in the rhythm of my insanity. All I have to do is keep silent about this and not bring it up. Yet she weakens me. It's almost as if she's making the decision about who I am, and in my own stubborn, willful way, I can admit to feeling a pang, something tightening inside. And before I can stop it, I find myself almost dazzled and moved that I might have the capacity to accept, though not return, her love. I wonder if even now, right here in nowheres, she can see the darkening clouds behind my eyes lifting. And though the coldness I have always felt leaves me, the numbness doesn't, and probably never will. This relationship will probably lead to nothing. This didn't change anything." Patrick finds himself actually feeling when he's with Jean, which harkens back to a moment he had when he was murdering another woman, where the following happens. "And later, my macabre joy sours, and I'm weeping for myself, unable to find solace in any of this, crying out, sobbing, I just want to be loved, cursing the earth and everything I have been taught, principles, distinctions, choices, morals, compromises, knowledge, unity, prayer. All of it was wrong, without any final purpose. All it came down to was die or adapt." Beneath all of it, Patrick is still human, and Jean brings some of that back to him, to the point that in the marketing emails that I mentioned a while ago, it said that Patrick eventually marries Jean and has a child with her, Patrick Jr. But at the time those emails occur, Patrick and Jean are going through a divorce, and Patrick is still in the business of murdering people, so whatever humanity she brought to him probably only lasted for a short while, until his compulsions once again reared their ugly heads. The final theme I'd like to touch on before we wrap this video up is something that people end up feeling when they become corrupted by all these forces, and end up feeling disconnected from life, that nobody cares about them or anything. Here's what Patrick thinks to himself when he's waiting for his brother at Dorsia. "While taking a piss in the men's room, I stare into a thin, web-like crack above the urinal's handle and think to myself that if I were to disappear into that crack, say somehow miniaturize and slip into it, the odds are good that no one would notice I was gone. No one would care. In fact, some, if they noticed my absence, might feel an odd, indefinable sense of relief. This is true. The world is better off with some people gone. Our lives are not all interconnected. That theory is a crock. Some people truly do not need to be here." Now you'll notice that I said this is something that people start to feel once they've experienced things that have made them into aberrations like Patrick has. But the thing is, it isn't true that nobody cares. It might be true that everyone you have around you right now doesn't care, but the world and people in it do care about you, and there is always the possibility that you will find someone who finally makes you realize this. It's true. In the vapid and self-obsessed world Patrick lives in, not many people care whether anyone around them lives or dies. But as we saw with Bethany and Jean, there are people who want to care about Patrick, who want what's best for him, but he is so far gone that nothing can make him realize that. People care, my friends, even when you're surrounded by the ones who don't. And while realizing that a lot of people don't will save you a lot of hardship, remembering that there are ones who do will keep you from drowning in all the misery that you may encounter in your life, a notion that Patrick unfortunately never quite managed to understand. So what do all of these things make Patrick? Well, I stated in the last video that I'd give him the benefit of the doubt and label him partially evil, and I still find that to be true. However, I'm now leaning towards the notion that he's more evil than he is not. If his killing of Paul Allen, the girl who provided the blood on the sheets, several other girls, and the homeless man and his dog are in fact real, then these are blatant cases of conscious and deliberate malice that is definitely evil. However, he is absolutely suffering from a mental illness, if not a few, and his delusions, no matter how vile, cannot be considered evil in my mind. They're terrible thoughts made manifest by a possibly schizophrenic mind. But I can say with certainty that everyone has had a terrible thought at least once in their life, and thoughts aren't what make a person evil. It's the actions that come as a result of those thoughts. So in the end, Patrick is an intensely disturbed narcissistic sociopath who, though drowning in consumerism, conformity, and a fabricated persona, is still a man like any other, whose true self has been so beaten down that there's now nothing left of the man he would have been had he not been exposed to all these things. Because he's so disconnected from humanity, he kills with impunity, fantasizes about the most horrendous things, and moves through the world as if nothing matters but himself, his own desires, and the misery he feels at being lost in a world that he wanted to find himself in. Patrick is absolutely a product of his environment, and in a different life, perhaps he would have brought a lot of good to the world. But the Patrick we see is without a doubt a malevolent, unpredictable entity, a terrible example of our inability to know just exactly who some people may be on the inside, as they exert every ounce of energy into becoming who they think they want to be on the outside. And while Patrick is a monster, we have to remember that everything we've talked about in this video, every horrid aspect of capitalism that goes unchecked, made Patrick into a monster. And if Patrick deserves to be condemned for everything he did, then everything that made him into who he is definitely deserves to be labeled evil. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Patrick? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, my members, and anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank. And a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.